This is Gavin Sirkin for the SuperReturns Africa Conference in Cape Town. Joining me is Dan Ariely, who is the Head of Research for Irrational Innovations and the founder of the Center for Advanced Hindsight. He's also a professor of psychology and behavioral economics. Professor, tell me first of all, what is behavioral economics?
So maybe the best way to think about behavioral economics is in contrast with standard economics. So in standard economics, we say that people are perfectly rational, people always make the right decision, think about the future and so on. Behavioral economics, we don't make assumptions. Instead, we put people in different situations, we see how they behave. And when you look at how people behave, you don't get rational answers. You get people who don't save and overeat and text and drive and have unprotected sex and don't take the medication on time and so on and so forth. And once you understand that human nature is different than perfect rationality, you actually go ahead and create different mechanisms. So for example, what kind of credit tools and spending tools would you give people who are perfectly rational? And what kind of credit and spending tools would you give to people who are basically being tempted all the time with other behaviors? They're very, very different. So it's not just about that humans are different in our view in economics and behavioral economics. It's that the kind of tools that we need to create, the kind of technology that is so important, is very different.
Okay, we're here in Africa, and I know you've done a few different experiments in Africa.
Yeah.
There's one that you've been doing with Mpesa in Kenya. Tell us about that.
So in that experiment, we were trying to get very poor people to save a bit of money, and we tried lots of different approaches, because we also say, hey, we don't know, let's just try different approaches. And what we found was that creating a physical reminder at the home was much, much more effective than giving people a 20% match. 20% match, that's a big deal. But what happened was that we created a physical coin, and that basically reminded people from time to time about saving. So imagine you have like a universe of things you can consider. Are you thinking about all of them? No. You're thinking about a small part of it. How do you get people to actually consider other options as well? You know, this idea actually came to me when I was in Soweto, and I saw a father buying funeral insurance for a week. He didn't have much money, and he took the certificate in a very ceremonious way, gave it to his son. And I thought to myself, he was a father that the visible thing he was doing was to take food away from the table. Usually he was taking his income and bringing food to the table and water and whatever it is. Now he was taking some of that income, diverting it to insurance, right? Effectively, the family would see less money coming in, but he did something to show that he was actually doing his job as a parent and so on. And I thought it's a beautiful thing to think about, how do we make the non-visible visible? How do we take things like saving and insurance and making them appreciative, people appreciating them in the family, and visible. And that actually now has all kinds of other approaches we're trying to take.
Okay, and one characteristic of Africa, keeping in mind the insurance savings that you're talking about, is that most of African populations are disenfranchised from formal financial services. What's the different mechanism that you apply to Africa compared to the rest of the world?
Yeah, so first of all, there are mechanisms that are important for the poor everywhere. And a lot of it is about overcoming temptation. So if you had a saving wallet, it was in the front pocket of your trousers, you're going to spend it. But if you had some saving wallet that had a little bit of friction, it was a little farther away, it was a little more difficult to take, it helps the poor everywhere. In terms of Africa, because there are no financial institutions, formalized financial institutions, there are all kinds of cultural mechanisms, harambis, or the saving groups. And we've been looking at those and trying to figure out not how do you come up with a technology that assumes that none of those things exist, but how do you come up with technology that builds on those cultural building blocks. So for example, again in Kenya, if you go to the hospital and you find out you have a big bill, you create a group on WhatsApp and you ask people for money. And it's actually interesting because the first person who gives you from that group establishes the norm for how much it's okay to give. So you don't want to ask cheapskates, because you want, or at least you don't want the cheapskate to answer quickly. You want the cheapskate to answer late, but you want the generous people to answer first. Now, that's a mechanism that is very intricate. Remittances within the country, across the country, these are all kind of mechanisms that have been developed And when we come to Africa to create any kind of fintech, we can't ignore those mechanisms. Coming up with here is something that works in the US or in Europe and so on, let's just import it here is not the right approach. We do need to understand all the mechanisms that have kind of bubbled up because of the lack of formal institutions and try to figure out how do we empower them in a better way.
Fascinating stuff. Professor Dan Ariely, thanks very much for joining us. This is Gavin Sirkin at the SuperReturn Africa Conference in Cape Town.